When I first put out word that I wanted to make these kinds of videos, someone asked me my advice on how to maintain a Christian attitude while they're in the middle of an purely academic and purely secular course on biblical studies. Now, I need to start out by saying that in my own personal experience, my courses on biblical studies have always been within the context of either a seminary that was explicitly concerned with Christian faith, or else in a graduate school that was a school of divinity that certainly took faith as a serious commitment and one to be not brushed aside. But the fact of the matter is, what you're going to find is that there's always going to be a spectrum between, from the one side, are people who are very sympathetic to Christian faith and very sympathetic to faith perspectives. And then way on the other side, you're going to find people who are hostile to faith perspectives. And depending on where your professor is or where the course is, you may find some responses better than others. You may find it more or less easy to relate your Christian faith to this particular course that you're taking. And I don't know about the details of any one particular course. I want to try to give some advice about how to hold your faith in context with the course that you're taking and learn what you can without having it shake you to your core. One of the things you need to understand is that academic biblical studies and theology are much less hostile today to traditional Christian faith than they were in the late 19th century. At that time, there was a lot of work that was focused only on the historical questions of how did this text come to be. And so you would divide up the Bible, especially the Old Testament, into a series of documents that it was argued were woven together at a later date to create what we now have. Well, today there's a lot more emphasis on the canonical context of Scripture. That is, how do we interpret the text as it stands today, as it has been passed on in the communities of faith. And it's a little less all concerned with historical questions. And so you may have a professor who was trained earlier than this more current trajectory, and so you may still be dealing with somebody who, because it's the history of biblical scholarship, may be emphasizing it in a way that feels more antagonistic. But the fact of the matter is that today there is much more freedom to be a person of faith in the midst of biblical studies than there used to be. The academic world in biblical studies and theology is very different, even very likely from when your pastor went through seminary. So it's possible, if you have a pastor who has told you about the godlessness of some of academic theology and biblical studies, that very well may have been true when they went through. But there has been a lot of very excellent work being done within the context of Christian tradition. It's very important to realize that quite possibly the most acclaimed New Testament scholar in the world is N.T. Wright, and he is an evangelical bishop in the Church of England. Something you need to know as a general rule is that academic biblical studies don't tend to care about what specific individuals believe about the Bible or about God. So they don't necessarily care what you personally believe or what I personally believe. And if your professor is being consistent with the values of the discipline, they also should write their work as if it doesn't really matter what they themselves believe. But what the academic world actually is interested in are the opinions and the beliefs and the convictions of whole communities of people. And so if it's possible that you can write your work and do your engagement with your studies from the point of view of saying, if you're in an Old Testament class, what would a Jewish person at that time when this was written, how would they interpret what was being written? What would this say in that context? Or if you're studying the New Testament, what would those first generations of Christians have said about this? How would they have interpreted this? And if you start with those kinds of questions and with that kind of attitude, instead of starting with, like we're trained to do in the church, what does this mean to me? How does this affect me? That might go a long way towards clearing up, kind of conflicts inside of yourself. Because the fact that your faith commitments might actually line up remarkably well with some of the faith commitments of the people who actually wrote the Bible doesn't really ever need to come up. You can still approach the question and say, what does this mean among the Jews? What does this mean among the Christians? How would people at the time, what would this have meant in the ancient pagan world? And those things can still stand regardless of whether your professor believes that to be the truth, or whether you believe it to be the truth, or whether anybody else believes it to be the truth. There is a way to say, what does this mean in this context that doesn't require your particular view about it to come up at all? Of course, the big difficulty, and this is still going to be a challenge no matter who you are, is that for those of us who have been in the church, who have given our lives to Jesus and have really focused on what this means to us and that it's the truth of God and it's life from the dead, it's tempting to then assume that the way we see God, the way we would speak about God, is the same way that these other people who wrote the Bible in the first place would have talked about God. And there's a tendency to kind of wash away all of salvation history, to wash away the particularities of context, and assume that when someone reads the first part of Genesis, that they would always be reading it as modern Christians do. And so it's very worthwhile to try to get inside the head of the people in a different time, in a different place, in a different culture, because it might reveal that there are some things that you might say about God that writer might not say. And there might be things that writer wants to say about God that might not fit neatly into the boxes you understand, God and talk about God fitting into. And sometimes that can be a very helpful thing. And so even though sometimes that feels like an attack on our very faith, sometimes what it's doing is actually chipping away at some of the distractions that we have imported into the faith. And it gives us a chance to listen with fresh ears and to see with fresh eyes what God has been saying to his people throughout history. Now, something I've seen, and I saw this when I was first in college as well, is that there are some people who are worried that if they don't make their conviction and belief in Jesus very public and very clear, both in the classroom setting and in their papers and the work for their class, that they're somehow not being faithful, that they're somehow failing in their ability and in the call to be evangelistic as a way to share the faith, and that if we were to simply treat it as an academic subject for a time, that somehow feels like it's a betrayal of the faith. But in point of fact, it actually might be better in that kind of context to try to get inside, the historical situation and make the argument based on exactly what is in the text and what will be going on in the historical context. Because again, in the context of academic biblical studies, what you yourself personally feel is not really the question that they care about. Now, it's important to stress that in other situations, when you're dealing with people and sharing faith, those are exactly the kinds of things that are the most important. But in the context of this classroom, you may find that talking about your faith may actually distract people from the actual historical good reasons and the witness borne to the gospel. And so I want to share, one of my theological hero that I did my graduate work on was a theologian named Thomas F. Torrance, or T.F. Torrance. And he lived in throughout basically the 20th century. He was born in the early 20th century in China in the mission field, and he died in 2007. And one of the things that happened was right before World War II, he was just finishing up his doctorate, and he was teaching for a year in America. He himself was Scottish. And before he went back to Scotland, he interviewed for a position at Princeton Theological Seminary. And at the time, Princeton was trying to develop the very first Department of Religious Studies that we have now all over the place in America. And when he went in for this interview, when they were meeting with him, they were trying to explain to him that you're going to have students from all over the map theologically. You're going to have Christians, you're going to have Jewish students, you're going to have Muslims, you're going to have atheists, and it's important that we treat this as though it is a secular discipline. And so it's very important that if you get this job, that there be absolutely no proselytizing. There must be no conversions in your classroom. And Torrance responded in this way that has struck me as being fascinating. He said, "My intention is to teach Christian theology as if it is a science. And in science, we don't think how we feel like thinking. We don't think how we choose to think. We think how we're compelled to think by the reality that we're investigating. And if I teach theology that way," he said, "I cannot guarantee there will be no conversions in my classroom." And he walked out the door assuming he wasn't going to get the job. Now, they offered it to him, but he had to move. He felt he needed to move back to Europe before World War II really got going. But that's the fascinating thing, that sometimes getting our personal convictions out of it and simply saying this is the historical context. Now, it may be that you respond to that historical context with conviction and faith, and someone else may not. But the gospel is compelling enough, I think, to be able to say, look, whatever you feel, this is the facts. These are the facts that we have to deal with. These are the facts that the church has had to deal with. And so whether or not you agree with this particular thing, this is the facts that we need to reckon with. Because the amazing thing is when you are able to present it in such a way that gets your own idiosyncrasies, your own likes and dislikes to go to the background, even if you can't get rid of them altogether, what it does is it helps to set the other person in this kind of context at ease, that you're not trying to get them to just agree with you. You're not trying to win an argument. In many ways, it actually, in some cases, can be a very faithful bearing witness to the gospel to say, this is what the church has believed that God has done. This is what the texts bear witness to. This is the God whom these people have believed in. And when people are given that kind of presentation, they're able to reckon with it on their own, and they can listen to the Spirit of God. Now, you can't that may feel like it's somehow not going the next step, but it's certainly within the academic context, the best thing to do is to make a good, solid, as impersonal as possible argument and let people deal with the consequences of it. So kind of the target audience for these kinds of videos are people who either already in some kind of Christian leadership, but especially those who are perhaps on their way toward Christian leadership in one way or another. And the thing is, if that's you, then the fact of the matter is the kinds of stuff that you might learn in a purely secular, purely academic course on the Bible are the kinds of things that whether you agree with it or not, whether you want to learn about it or not, whether you like it or not, are really important that you be exposed to. Because just as it's important to try to get your mind inside of how a first century Israelite would respond to the gospel, or how a pre-Christian Israelite would respond to God's activity through the prophets, or how those first generations of Christians would respond to various things in the letters of Paul. Just as that's important, it's also important in our current context to be able to get inside the head of people who disagree with you on these topics. Because there are other people who have heard about these too. The things that you're learning in these kinds of courses are the things that everybody learns in these kinds of courses. As someone who's involved in some kind of Christian leadership, you're going to meet people who have heard about these things, and they're going to want to know what you think about them, and they're going to want to know how they can respond to them. Now, most Christians can go their whole lives and never hear about them, and they can live quite happy lives, and they don't necessarily need to know all these things. But if you're called to be in Christian leadership, there's a sense in which you really do need to know about these things. And you may not agree with all of them, and you may have to come to your own peace with them, but this is the history of the discipline. And to simply brush it away would not be responsible. If someone were to find themselves in the context of ministry, and all of a sudden that's the first time they're hearing about some of these things, it is actually a more difficult way to engage with them. And if that's the first time you're hearing about this, you're not going to be prepared. So I would encourage that you take these courses as seriously as you can, even if you find them personally uncomfortable or personally challenging. So in the end, how do you maintain a Christian attitude in the midst of this kind of study? Well, the number one most important thing you should do is the kind of thing you should do in any context, and make sure you have a small group of people that you can meet with on a regular basis. Because if nothing else, what that's going to do in this context is remind you that in the classroom, where the things that are being talked about can sometimes feel lifeless, can sometimes feel draining, can sometimes feel distracting, and make you wonder, why does anybody read this at all? That small group of people can remind you of what you already know, and that is that the gospel of Jesus Christ is life from the dead. So if you've got that going on, if you've got that source of people who are helping you out, keeping you accountable to your Christian commitments, and reminding you of who you are and what you're about, then my next suggestion is to try to not take the issues that you learn about in this class too personally. In general, most biblical studies academics are not necessarily trying to get you to believe one thing or another. What they want to do is say, this is what the history of the research has shown, and we've got to deal with it. And so if you find that your professor is really antagonistic, if it's hard for you to kind of to look at it in terms of getting inside the head of the historical community, then try to practice understanding these issues from your professor's point of view. Even if you end up disagreeing with it, that's a good skill to develop when you're in Christian leadership in any kind. If you can go into this experience trying to say, I'm going to learn whatever I can, and to not necessarily assume that everything that you hear has to be interpreted just the way that you hear it, you may find that there really is something to learn. You may find that there really are things that you can learn from this kind of historical and secular and academic engagement that will actually help you make sense out of the text, that will somehow turn a light on in some places. We go, oh, I remember hearing about this. This really does make sense. Now, it won't for everything, but for some of those things you might. And the thing is, I think there's probably a lot that you can learn from those kinds of classes, even if you don't always agree with it, and maybe it's not as much as your professor thinks that you should learn. But at the very least, if you're going to be in Christian leadership, it's very helpful to know what has been said by academics, whether they're committed to the church or not, to understand what they're saying, why they were saying it, and why it made sense to them. And that, at the very least, is very good training for Christian leadership. Well, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or you have any topics you'd like me to consider taking up, please email me at pastorstevik@gmail.com, and I look forward to seeing you next time.